Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about the axial skeleton. So when it comes to the human skeleton, we can subdivide it in two major ways: the axial skeleton and the appendicular skeleton. The axis of your body is the center of your body, and so the bones at the center of your body form the axial skeleton. That is your skull, your vertebral column, including the sacrum and coccyx, and it also includes the thoracic cage, which is your rib cage and sternum. The appendicular skeleton then is basically the bones of your arms and your legs. So bones like the scapula and the hip bone belong to the appendicular skeleton. So the skull is part of the axial skeleton, and the bones of the skull can be divided into two major categories: the cranial bones, which enclose the brain, and then the facial bones, which of course form the face. The vertebral column is composed of several small bones, and then the sacrum and the coccyx. And that's what I want to spend some time talking about in this video, is the vertebral column. We have several vertebrae that make up the vertebral column. Vertebrae is the plural, vertebra is the singular. And we can divide these into different groups. The vertebrae in the neck region or cervical region are called cervical vertebrae. Okay, you have 7 cervical vertebrae. I'm going to turn it this way for a minute. So 7 cervical vertebrae. Next are the thoracic vertebrae. Okay. The thoracic vertebrae, there's 12 of those. They all attach to ribs, so they're really easy to identify. So you can see there's a rib here attaching to this vertebra, so this has to be a thoracic vertebra. So 7 cervical vertebrae and 12 thoracic vertebrae. Down here we have our lumbar vertebrae. You have 5 of those. And then a single sacrum and a single coccyx. And it's kind of easy to remember the numbers of vertebrae because you eat breakfast at 7, you eat lunch at 12, and then you eat dinner at 5. The vertebral column has some curvatures to it. It's not perfectly straight. The cervical vertebrae curve slightly anteriorly, so they go forward just a little bit. Okay. The thoracic vertebrae form a slight posterior curvature, and then the lumbar vertebrae again go anterior a little bit, so they go forward a little bit. The sacrum has a slight posterior curvature. The sacrum used to be separate vertebrae, but during the process of development, the 5 vertebrae that make up the sacrum, they end up fusing together. The same is true for the coccyx. The coccyx used to be 4 separate vertebrae that fused together through the process of development. Coming back to the cervical vertebrae, the first 2 cervical vertebrae have special names. The very first cervical vertebra that the skull rests upon is called the atlas. Right? And this comes from Greek mythology. Atlas was the god that would hold up the world, so this is the bone that holds up your skull. Below the atlas is the axis. The axis. So the axis has a unique structure on it called the dens. And this allows for rotation of the head. The remaining cervical vertebrae are referred to by numbers. Actually, the atlas and the axis can also be referred to by numbers. So the atlas is cervical vertebra 1, the axis is cervical vertebra 2, and then we have cervical vertebra 3 through 7. As I mentioned already, the thoracic vertebrae are unique in that they all have an attachment to ribs. Actually, there's 3 articulation points between each rib and each vertebra. So each rib touches each vertebra 3 different places. So that means for a single vertebra, there are 6 attachment points for these ribs. Now let's take a closer look at how inferior and superior vertebrae attach to one another. The attachments between the above and below vertebrae occur at parts called the inferior articular processes and then the superior articular processes. You can't see these processes very well on an articulated skeleton because they're covered up by the bone. So we can see these in more detail when we look at the disarticulated skeleton. But each vertebra has two inferior articular processes and two superior articular processes. Okay? And those parts are used to connect to the vertebra above and below. Of course, the atlas does not attach to a vertebra superior to it. Instead, it attaches to the skull. So the superior articular facets on the atlas articulate or join with the occipital condyles on the skull. Likewise, the lumbar vertebra does not articulate with a vertebra below it because that's where the sacrum is. But the sacrum used to be vertebrae, so it still does possess similar characteristics to vertebrae. It has superior articular processes that articulate with the last lumbar vertebra's inferior articular processes.